It was dark when Army Major Francis Garda finally arrived in the mid-sized city in central Mississippi that was Jack Turner's last known whereabouts. The first signs of civilization were billboards by the road advertising beer, lawyers, and car dealerships. The road widened and filled with more traffic. Occasionally, a lone pedestrian would appear suddenly in Garda's headlights, picking their way precariously along the road's edges, incongruous for no other reason than that they were not inside a car or inside a building. Other than that, the headlights of Garda's rental car mostly just illuminated a repetitive cadence of trash, abandoned buildings, gas stations, weed-strewn lots, and dollar discount stores. From what Garda could see so far, the place was typical and unremarkable, built up over the last 50 years or so to do nothing but accommodate automobile traffic. Garda could see that the sun was about to come up. The eastern horizon had gone from black to a soft purple. Across town, the pre-dawn light filtered through the row of windows with the cafe curtains that ran all down one wall of the old records office. In the shade at the back of the room, Jack Turner hunched over a dispersed pile of property plats, maps, and diagrams pulled from various folders and binders. He sorted, correlated, flipped papers over, and pondered. The sun began to break over the horizon. Dr. Eugene Ma could tell it was going to be another hot, hazy day as he pulled into the parking lot of the State Crime Laboratory. Dr. Ma parked his car and got out. He collected his thermos of homebrewed coffee from his back seat and was about to head into the county coroner's office and laboratories where he had worked for the past decade. There was an exceptionally tall woman with shoulder-length dark hair standing in the parking lot. She was alone. She had stationed herself in a way that Dr. Ma couldn't help but walk right past her if he was going to try to enter the building. As he got closer, she looked down at him with eyes that were ice blue. "May I help you?" Dr. Ma asked. "I'm Francis Garda," the woman replied. "I got your information from someone I work with. You might be able to help me." "Is that so?" Dr. Ma asked, cradling his thermos. "Well," he asked, "what is it you're inquiring about?" "The Colonel Turner case," Garda said. "Oh, I see. The Colonel Turner case." Ma contemplated this information. "Are you the police? They also have been asking for everything we've got on her." "No, Doctor, I'm not the police," Garda said. "Well, if you will excuse me, I have to go tell the police about you right away," Ma replied. "I'm sure you probably already know her son Jack is a fugitive at this very moment. I am obligated to contact law enforcement immediately if anyone shows up looking for Jack Turner or asking anything about him." Garda smiled. She took out her ID. "I am a U.S. Army Major," she said. "I am about to get reassigned. I just found out that I have a brother, and I was just trying to find out more about him. That's all. This is just personal stuff." Dr. Ma took Garda's credentials and carefully scrutinized them. Then he handed them back to Garda. "How long have you been in the Army?" Dr. Ma asked. Garda told him. Dr. Ma asked, "You were there? The war?" "2 tours," Garda replied. "One in Iraq and then another in Afghanistan." Dr. Ma said, "I had a son who was in the Army. He was in Iraq." Garda said nothing. Dr. Ma said, "My son was the greatest man I ever knew." The two of them stood together in the steadily increasing heat of the parking lot. They spoke to each other for nearly an hour. They talked of soldiers, of war, of families, and of loss. Finally, Dr. Ma checked his wristwatch and said, "Oh my, look at the time. You must come inside, Major. I will assist you with whatever you need." "So, I understand Jack Turner's mother died in a fire?" Garda asked when they were inside the air conditioning of Dr. Ma's office. The doctor knew exactly which case Garda was referring to. Dr. Ma's background was as a forensic anthropologist. He had done the initial forensic examination himself in the aftermath of the event that took place years ago at a sheriff's office. Dr. Ma told Garda, "She was almost 42 at the time of the incident. It is the strangest case, at least of my career." "As far as cases of spontaneous human combustion go," Dr. Ma continued, "there have only been a couple hundred of them that have ever been documented, and that number is spread out over at least 2.5 centuries. "I'm sorry?" Garda asked. "What do you mean, human combustion? I thought she died in a fire." "Yes, that is true, I assure you," Dr. Ma replied. "But there were no other sources of initial combustion besides the Colonel herself in this case." Dr. Ma went into more detail for Garda about the peculiar case of a retired Army colonel who, in the weeks immediately following the attacks of 9/11, briefly took a young deputy hostage in the lobby of a sheriff's station. The ordeal that particular morning had only lasted as long as it took for the sun to peek over the horizon. Colonel Turner never spoke a word to anyone after getting the young deputy's gun away from him. She just stood there, surrounded, guns pointed at her, the gun in her hand pointed at the head of her captive. As the first of the sun's rays, it was reported, shone through the lobby windows, an oily steam began to vent from her skin wherever it was exposed to the sunlight. All the witnesses to the occurrence had stood rooted to the spot, watching in shock and horror as the anomaly unfolded in front of them. With the strange unctuous steam ejecting from Colonel Turner's skin as if from hundreds of tiny geysers and then turning into flame, Colonel Turner simply lowered her gun and pushed the deputy away from her. A second later, she caught fire and was consumed in the blaze. All that was left of her was a 2-inch-long arc of orbital bone and several loose teeth. "What about the other cases of human combustion?" Garda asked, stunned by what she was hearing. "Is there anything in the medical literature about people going up in flames all of a sudden?" Dr. Ma grinned, then replied, "Let me show you something." The doctor tapped a few keys on his computer. The screen pulled up an image of several long, translucent teeth arranged in rows, held down under a sheet of plastic. The teeth looked human-like, but they were longer in the root, and all of them were slightly more pointed than normal. "How many do you count, Major Garda?" Dr. Ma asked. Garda took a few seconds to count the teeth and then replied, "I see 68 of them in that photo, Dr. Ma." Dr. Ma hit a few more keys, and the screen pulled up another image. It was a dental X-ray. "I finally found this last year," Ma said, tapping on the screen. "I had a hunch, and I tracked down Colonel Turner's family dentist when she was just Miss Turner. The old dentist is still alive, but he retired to Florida already. I finally made contact with him, and he was able to share these with me." Then he asked Garda, "What do you see here?" "Well, I see an X-ray of healthy-looking human teeth," Garda replied. "There are only 28 by my count, so maybe whoever this is got their wisdom teeth pulled before the X-ray was taken." "These are hers," Dr. Ma said. "These are Colonel Turner's." He clicked back to the other image, the one of the dozens of smaller, longer, more pointed and translucent teeth. And these are also hers, Dr. Ma said. These are Colonel Turner's. He gave Garda the mouse so that she could toggle between the two images on her own. And these were definitely Colonel Turner's teeth, Garda asked after taking time to scrutinize what she was looking at. She had the newer image up on the screen. What I mean is, you're sure Colonel Turner wasn't wearing a macabre necklace made out of other people's teeth? Or she didn't have a bunch of extra teeth in her pocket for some strange reason when the fire happened? I guarantee you, Dr. Ma said, that all of those teeth were attached to someone's upper and lower jaw at time of death. Now, the fire did completely cremate everything but the teeth and one small piece of facial bone somehow, Dr. Ma said. But witnesses reported that Colonel Turner was alone. There was nobody else whose teeth these could have been. Again, these were fully attached to someone at time of death. So the colonel certainly didn't have a bag of extra teeth in her pocket or anything like that. These all came out of her mouth. Garda didn't need any medical training to know that what Dr. Ma was suggesting could not be possible. "Tell me again when this x-ray was taken?" she asked. "This was taken not long after her high school graduation," Dr. Ma replied. "These were taken right before Miss Turner began her career in the U.S. Army and eventually became Colonel Turner." Garda stared at the image of the x-rays. She stayed silent, but she could feel her hair begin to stand up on her scalp. Nothing about this was right or normal. "But how?" she asked. "I mean, I've heard of people who have too many teeth, but they're born like that. So you're telling me that Jack Turner's mom was born with a normal set of teeth and then had over 60 in her mouth when she died? How's that possible?" "Ahem. Sudden onset cryptic hyperdontia," Dr. Ma replied. "This is the only known case in the world." "You know," Dr. Ma continued, looking up at Garda, "it is really so very odd." "Geez, which part?" Garda asked. It is very odd that nobody ever came asking about this," replied Dr. Ma. "I mean, not until the recent business with Jack Turner escaping police custody." Dr. Ma started tapping on the screen of the monitor again while he spoke. "This is a truly extraordinary event," he said, "and nobody came asking about it, not in all the years since it happened. Until her son became a wanted man recently here in Mississippi, and the police finally started asking who Jack Turner was and where he came from. It was almost as if none of this might as well have ever happened." It was still early at the police precinct. Guthridge was at her desk, drinking coffee to wash down a breakfast of leftover bacon. Carrington had pulled up a chair opposite her. He was only having coffee. Carrington was considering an idea Guthridge had just posited about Marsh and Turner. The business with the phony VIN on one of the cars from the clearing was leading her to speculate Marsh and Turner were actually caught up together in some type of insurance fraud scheme. Guthridge was telling Carrington how her next step was to start querying the National Insurance Crime Bureau database for anything that might divulge further clues about the burned-up car. But Carrington couldn't get his mind off of the corpse in the Cadillac. "I got another angle," Carrington suggested to her. "It's one we should try. Might be a way to get the identity of that mummy that was sitting in the Cadillac." "Okay, what's your idea?" asked Guthridge. "That suit the dead guy was wearing," Carrington said. "I got a good look at it. I don't think it's from the 1940s. I think it's from even earlier than that." "How does that help us?" Guthridge asked. "Well, you got to understand how people were back then," Carrington said. "You should know all about that," Guthridge chided. "Very funny," Carrington said. "No, I'm serious. This was an entirely different time. It's hard to imagine how different people were back then, in the 1920s or even before that. You got to remember, those were still the days before cars became such a big part of everyone's everyday world. Back then, you didn't get in your car to go somewhere and do something. You got in your suit and your hat to go somewhere and do something." Guthridge said nothing and just listened. "That suit the dead guy is wearing," Carrington continued, "it would have been a real big deal for him, a big investment. Most people back then would have only had just one." Guthridge's eyes lit up. "Photographs were still pretty rare, too," Guthridge said. "Not like today." "Yep," Carrington said, nodding. "If our dead guy in the Cadillac ever stood for a photograph even once," she said, "chances are he was wearing that suit for the cameraman." "It's a long shot," Carrington said. "It's a quick reverse image search," Guthridge replied. "I just got to get forensics to email me some photos." After that, Detectives Carrington and Guthridge agreed to swing by the hospital around noon. More information needed to be extracted from Caroline Marsh. Garda's first stop was the city hospital. Caroline Marsh was still a patient there, according to Garda's latest intelligence from Sergeant Gladys Stoll. Garda was feeling frustrated. Her plan was not fully fleshed out yet. There were still too many unknowns. Reconnaissance was the only path forward, Garda decided as she parked her rental in the hospital's visitor lot. Garda talked her way past the hospital's front desk. That was the easy part. Garda knew there would be a police presence waiting for her once she made it up to the ward where Caroline Marsh was. There would also be locked doors and strict hospital protocols, not to mention alert and suspicious staff. Her best option was to pick a place that was as close as possible to where Marsh was, and then simply wait. But where? Too many staff and patients would congregate in the pharmacy or the cafeteria. That means too many eyes in those places, too high a risk. And Garda certainly couldn't just wander the hallways. Garda got on the elevator and hit the button for Marsh's floor. The first thing Garda noticed when stepping back out of the elevator was that there was a hallway with seating and lots of windows on one side of the elevator lobby. It was a kind of third place the designers of the ward had added to the building, a place for the comfort of patients and visitors, away from the beeping machines and the hustle of nurses. It was a quiet spot, a place a stricken person might seek out when they needed to get away from their hospital bed. Garda went to the elevator lobby and bought a coffee from a vintage vending machine. The dispenser burped and gurgled, and black oily liquid filled the foam cup it had ejected. Garda took her drink, then went and sat in the hallway full of windows. Time passed. The coffee in her hands had been cold for hours. Garda had been alone in the hallway with the large glass windows except on 2 occasions. Once, an old man and an old woman stepped out into the hallway, followed by a young woman who was pulling an IV stand. The young woman was not Caroline Marsh. The trio sat at the far end of the hallway and talked in hushed tones. The young woman quietly sobbed. Eventually, a doctor came out and got them. Later, a couple got off the elevator and turned and walked side by side into the hallway towards where Garda was sitting. The man and the woman both looked grim and preoccupied. They both had on overcoats and expensive shoes. It was obvious to Garda they were not a couple in the typical sense. These were a couple of cops. Garda did not look up, but watched them out of the corner of her eye. The man looked like he was near retirement age. The woman was just a couple of years older than Garda was. The expressions on their faces gave a lot away to a person as observant as Garda. The woman's expression was of someone on the hunt, with much to gain from netting her prey. The man, on the other hand, just looked tired and haunted. The lady cop looked Garda up and down as they approached. There was the slightest pause, like she was about to ask Garda a question. But no words were exchanged, and the two swept past Garda and into the hospital wing. Just before the automatic doors closed, Garda stood quickly and stepped over to them. For a brief moment, she saw the backs of the two cops and the busy hallway they were walking through. Garda saw them pass the nurse's station and head even further into the unit. Beyond them, Garda caught a glimpse of a man who was seated outside one of the rooms. The man had seen the two cops and was beginning to stand. He was in uniform, another cop. And now Garda knew exactly where they were keeping Caroline Marsh. Through the rafters below his boots, Turner could hear the daily minutiae of the records office. Fans whirred and copy machines hummed. A bored office lady chatted on the phone with her sister when it was obvious there were no customers to serve. Turner could tell there was one other person working there with her. It was a man. He sounded like he was as old as the farmer Turner had worked for, but more polite when he spoke. The woman would chitter at the man's mumbled jokes, then tell her sister what the man was doing whenever he left for a bathroom break. The day wore on. All of this barely registered in Turner's mind, however. He was instead focused on adding to the webwork of data points attached with tape and string to the wall of chimney bricks up in the attic. He pinned up a few new sheets of paper and then reconnected old kite strings. He took a step back, contemplated the relationship of nodes, and then leaned back in and changed more items on the wall, reassessing connections between data points. At the center of the webwork was an old Polaroid. It was of an overweight gentleman in an expensive suit. Despite his age, his hair was still dark. There was an extremely pleased smirk on his face. He was looking at someone just off camera. This was the retired Senator Bo Doty, the man whom Turner's mother had been investigating immediately before her death. All the kite strings eventually connected all the other elements to this Polaroid. Well, that was a bust, Guthridge said to Carrington as they walked back out to their car in the hospital's main parking lot. The visit proved to be futile. The doctor responsible for Marsh's care, a Dr. Ringle, and his staff had to do a minor operation on Marsh's damaged arm in the morning. She was in recovery when the two detectives arrived. They had waited all day outside Marsh's room, but no interview could be done. They both returned to the precinct. The sun started getting low in the afternoon sky. The chairs lined up in the hallway cast straight, severe shadows across the linoleum floor. Marsh never made an appearance. Neither did Jack Turner. It had been enough time that Garda feared she would start to draw attention if she stayed into the evening. She dumped her coffee and left. Garda drove across town and paid for a hotel room. She was tired and decided all she could do now was get some sleep. All that could be done for the day was done. Jack Turner was still an enigma. Just a photocopy on a printout, a name on a life insurance policy, and a ghost in an old farmer's stories. Carrington was hit with the sweet smell of a thick carpet of dead leaves rotting in the middle of a forest. He opened one eye, then both. He was seated in a clearing somewhere in the middle of a strange old forest. Through the undergrowth all around him, Carrington could see weathered tombstones leaning and lurching up at various angles, only their top halves visible above the brush and fallen leaves. He struggled to make out the lettering on some of them, but for some reason could not figure out what any of them said. Late afternoon sunlight struggled to pierce the thick canopy of the ancient twisted oak and the pine trees surrounding the clearing. Carrington could feel, as much as he could hear, the quiet rustling of unseen creatures beneath the carpet of decaying leaves beneath him. Shafts of light filtering through the dense foliage created ethereal beams that illuminated some of the graves at one of the far edges of the clearing. Carrington looked up over the weeds and the tombstones to where he remembered Caroline Marsh had been standing just moments before. He wanted to ask her another question about the Jack Turner case. But it wasn't Marsh who was standing there. It was a strangely dressed young man. He had long hair and a beard, and wore an oversized leather jacket. Under the jacket he wore what looked like a monk's tunic. Carrington stood up and brushed the dirt off of his hands. The man was not looking at him. He was scanning the trees that surrounded the small woodland cemetery. His eyes looked like they were nothing but empty glass marbles. "Who the hell are you?" Carrington asked. The man must have heard him because he stopped and turned his face directly at Carrington. Then the man raised up his hands as if in supplication. "Yet what you asked me about in former times, and which I did not tell you then, now I desire to tell," he said to Carrington, "but you do not inquire after it." Carrington was about to tell this guy he was impeding a police investigation, but then the man started calling out for someone at the top of his lungs. He was yelling, "Jack Turner!" Carrington woke up suddenly with a loud yelp. He was at his desk at the precinct. A few detectives were huddled around a monitor across the office from where Carrington sat. They looked up at him briefly, then went back to what they were doing without a word. Carrington pulled his feet off of his desk. His ancient office chair creaked as he sat up straight. It was late afternoon. He had been there all day. There had still been no word on Jack Turner. Carrington thought for a second he should take a break and then eat something, then realized he was not feeling hungry in the least. Carrington figured he would stay late at the precinct and follow up on the other two directions the case had presented. One was the enigma of Dennis Peltry, and the other the very real presence of Petey Ghee. Carrington still had more case files to look through. He had exhausted the computer database, and now the records he was looking through were so old they had to be brought up to him from storage in aged cardboard boxes. That didn't bother Carrington. He liked the smell of forgotten case files in ancient cardboard boxes the way some people love the smell of old books. Guthridge spent only part of the afternoon at the precinct. After that, she headed home to work there. She enjoyed working in the quiet of her living room in the small, quaint house that she owned. The domicile only had 2 bedrooms. One of them she kept for her mother when she visited. This meant that Guthridge's living room doubled as her office. Most of the house lights were off this time of night. and Guthridge's face and eyes were lit up by the blue glow of her computer screen. Guthridge, being a police officer, did not just have access to the public internet. She also had a license to utilize certain law enforcement-only databases. Guthridge had received the photographs of the suit that was found on the mummified corpse in the Cadillac down by the creek. The forensics team had reassembled the suit and spread it out on a steel morgue table. They took photos of it, both prone and supine, then emailed the photos to Guthridge. Guthridge had in turn uploaded the photos and now sat slightly hunched in front of her monitor. One hand she held propped up against her mouth, causing Guthridge's nose to deviate a little to the right as she did so. With the other hand she held a pencil, tapped at the keyboard, manipulated the mouse, and sipped from a glass of water. Guthridge tapped and searched, looking for any match to the photographs of that old suit. The police officer assigned to watch over Caroline Marsh in the hospital that night thought the young lady looked like someone dressed up to scare little kids at a Halloween haunted house. The theme would have been Haunted Insane Asylum. Marsh would be one of the pallid, wraithful inmates with makeup added to make their eyes look extra hollow. Marsh plodded up and down the hallway in her hospital gown, seemingly determined to pace like that all night. "Miss Marsh," the officer said, "shouldn't you try to turn in and get some rest?" Marsh looked up at the officer. Wisps of hair clung to the side of her pale face, and the skin on her bare arms was covered with healed-over cuts and abrasions. She truly looked like someone stuck between the two worlds of the living and the dead. "I'll sleep when the sun comes up," Marsh replied, and kept pacing. It was nighttime in an outdated and run-down shopping center at the edge of town. Other than the weeds that pushed their way up through various cracks in the neglected pavement, this was a lifeless place. The city had no plans for renovating the derelict and forgotten shopping center, and it wasn't something that had been built to last to begin with. There were still several hours before the dawn broke. Trash carried on the wind piled in one of the corners of the parking lot, where two rows of mostly abandoned storefronts met at an angle. Occasional gusts of night wind stirred and agitated the piles of refuse until the pieces of it rose up like a vortex of vexed and disfigured starlings before settling back down again. The parking lot was vast and dark and decaying at the edges. A lone Cadillac sat far outside the pool of light cast by the last working lamp pole. The trunk of the Cadillac was standing open. Hearth stood next to the vehicle, motionless, arms folded. Several bats flitted back and forth in the air above him. Headlights appeared at the far edge of the parking lot where it sat adjacent to a long, straight road. The road had no sidewalks, just narrow waste spaces of crabgrass and litter, forcing pedestrians as close as possible to the traffic whizzing by. The road ran like this for miles and miles, past dozens of other derelict buildings and shopping centers just like the one where Hearth was standing. A pair of headlights approached, slowed, and pulled into the parking lot. Hearth lifted his frame away from the car and stood straight. As the lights got closer to the Cadillac, Hearth could see it was a small, two-door sports car. The sports car pulled up alongside the Cadillac. The engine purred for a second, then shut off. A young man with a beard and long hair, wearing a leather jacket over top of a long brown tunic, stepped out of the sports car. The collection of talismans and amulets that hung from a dozen slim chains around his neck jingled. This made Hirth emit a grim and bemused chuckle. Hirth walked over to the newcomer. He was easily a head taller than the younger man, so Hirth squared his massive shoulders and looked down upon him. Hirth reached out with a large, cement-like hand and flicked one of the amulets up so that it bounced off the young man's cheek just next to where a pale tattoo of a pentagram lingered. The young man did not flinch. He held a smile on his face, but said nothing to the bigger man. "Petey Ghee?" Hirth asked. The young man nodded. Hirth raised his chin and looked down his nose at Ghee. "If we were still mere chattel," Hirth said, "beholden to their silly little rules, I would have to thank you for dragging me out of those woods the other day." The younger man kept his face riveted in a diplomatic smile that revealed nothing. "But we're not mere chattel. Not any more, are we?" Hirth said down to Ghee. Ghee held his expression and made no reply. Hirth sighed. He turned and looked over his shoulder at the row of forlorn and vacant storefronts behind him. In one of them, one that had once been a dry cleaner's, the front door was missing from its frame. The space it left behind was a rectangle of total darkness. Hirth turned back to Ghee. "Big night," Hirth said. A bat appeared out of the dark, flitted through the air between the two men, then was gone. Neither man moved. "In the whole arc of your one single insignificant life," Hirth said, leaning forward slightly so that the shadows shifted across his face. "Across all the entire span of time in which the universe blinks into and then out of existence, this night, tonight, is your only chance. If you're going to escape time, if you are ever going to get out of the predicament we were all born into, this is your only chance, ever." Hirth raised a fist and jabbed his thumb in the direction of the ugly, dark building behind him and the empty doorway that awaited. "If you place a foot across that threshold," Hirth said to Ghee, "you take your first real step towards immortality. You left all the chattel far below the hour you took on being an acolyte of His grace. But if you enter in there, you will come face to face with His Grace LeBlanc directly. You will behold him directly, and you will be educed." There were now more bats, circling in the air above the two men's heads. "Greater darkness will be granted unto you," Hirth said, speaking now more like he was chanting an incantation. "Time itself will begin to loose its grip upon you. You will be an antipath of time, and that enmity shall continue as long as your master, His Grace LeBlanc, looks upon this doomed universe with his undead eyes." Another few moments passed with the two men facing off and the vile, possessed bats circling above. Finally, the young man lifted his hands in an attitude of reverence. He turned his face to the bats and the stars and the night, and he spoke. "Whoever has come to understand the world has found only a sea of corpses," Ghee intoned. "Whoever has sought a corpse and found a prince in this world is superior to this world of the quick and of the dead." Hirth smiled, grim and wide. He took a step so that he was no longer between Ghee and the storefront of the old dry cleaners. With a gallant sweep of one arm, Hirth indicated the direction that Ghee was supposed to go. Ghee lowered his hands and walked past Hirth. Ghee crossed the parking lot, stepped up onto the curb, and entered into the blackness of the open doorway. Petey Ghee drew in a breath and tried to steel his nerves against whatever was about to happen next. If all of his occult knowledge was a grand volume of graying parchment bound in hide, the exact nature of an educement was like a page that had been torn out. Ghee knew that there was now no deity he could pray to who would help him through this if something went wrong. Like an astronaut on a maiden spacewalk, stepping out into the vast and indifferent void for truly the first time, Petey Ghee was becoming godlessly alone as he tread carefully through the dusky interior of the abandoned dry cleaners. Ghee's abdomen bumped up against what must have once been the old service counter where customers dropped off their laundry. He felt in the dark around its edges until he found a part of it that flipped up and aside on hinges that let him pass through into the back of the business. His face brushed something that was either cobwebs or ancient garments still hanging on their racks in the dark. Ghee pushed through with his hands. The place smelled of chloroform and ammonia, and then he felt the spiders. Despite his arms and legs being covered in layers of his clothing, Petey Ghee was struck with the distinct sensation of hundreds of spiders, perhaps thousands, some of them as large as a human hand, racing up and down the skin of his arms and legs. At first, Ghee jumped backwards and started screaming, but then he checked himself. Ghee could still not see anything in the dark, but as if someone had flipped on an old television screen right in the front of his mind, Ghee saw a brightly lit and very clear picture of Hirth. Hirth was still outside, still standing by the old Cadillac with the trunk wide open. Hirth's face was an expression of pure, malevolent mirth. His neck was crooked slightly. He had been listening, and he had heard Ghee's scream from within the dry cleaners, and he was laughing. The image enraged Ghee in a way he never really felt rage before. He stopped flailing his limbs in the dark. He stopped screaming. He held still, and he let the sea of unseen spiders crawl all over him. They crawled across his face and his ears. The smaller ones were feeling their way up his nose. He forced a step forward, and then another, deeper into the dark. A vulture awaited him. Scant moonlight seeped through a crack in the upper wall at the back of the dry cleaners. It illuminated the shoulders and the bare head of the malevolent beast. The vulture was easily the size of a man, if not bigger. At first, the giant vulture held itself motionless as Ghee forced himself to walk closer to it. But then, slowly, it swept one black wing out to its side in a movement broad and fluid. Petey felt the spiders drain off of him. He heard their thousands of pointed legs scatter on the floor and flee into the darkness behind him. The vulture flapped its terrible wings and made a giant hop across the room, then up into the air against the ceiling. It halted and somehow hovered just above Petey Ghee. It was glowing now. Its feathers, feet, and head were all lit up, not by earthly light, but by some alien energy that still left the rest of the room completely dark, but nevertheless cast an image into Ghee's mind. The vulture became a man, or at least the desiccated corpse of a man. The head was hairless like a skull. The nose and eyes were gone. There was some dried, leathery skin still clinging to the face around the cheeks and the lips, and there was a set of translucent, gnarled ears sticking out of the sides of its head. In its mouth was what must have been 100 tiny, sharp teeth. The corpse lowered itself slowly, touching down on the floor with 2 swollen feet. Its proportions were supernaturally distorted so that it filled Ghee's entire field of vision. The arms were bare, but the rest of the body, from the armpits down, was loosely wrapped in what Ghee could tell had once been a burial shroud. The shroud was tattered and shredded, as if it had been torn by teeth. The bones were exposed in both of the forearms of the corpse, and the shreds of shroud hung limply around exposed flesh. Ghee could see that the front of the lower abdomen had been partially chewed away, exposing entrails and the top curved edge of the pelvic ilium, still slightly wet and translucent. "Put your hand in," the corpse commanded Ghee. There were now twin orbs of evil yellow light flickering in the eye sockets. Trembling, Ghee put one of his hands into the opening of the fiend's lower abdomen and pressed it against the cold serpentine intestines. "Pestilence," the corpse spat. Ghee was staring up into its mouthful of small teeth. They were all yellowed, cracked, and very sharp. "Pestilence," Ghee eventually managed to repeat back to the monster. "Inversion," it hissed, sounding like a giant snake that could swallow the world. "Inversion," Ghee repeated back, stammering slightly as he did. "Mockery," the fiend demanded. An hour before dawn broke, LeBlanc, tall and stretched out, sepulchral and pale in the tattered burial shroud, emerged from the abyssal void of the doorway like a specter rising out of a tomb. His dreadful, veined feet were bare and white as grave markers below the tattered hem of the mouldered shroud. They touched down lightly on the concrete just past the door frame. Hirth stood at attention next to the Cadillac's open trunk. "Your Grace," Hirth said from the darkness of the parking lot, then continued to wait silently. LeBlanc paused on the strip of filthy concrete for a few moments. Hirth could not see the malevolent yellow flames that were his eyes, but Hirth could feel LeBlanc's glare upon him in the dark. LeBlanc took another step, then another, then stepped off the curb. He paused again and raised his visage to the night sky. A cluster of fiendish bats held a tight, halo-like formation in the air. A bead of sweat formed on Hirth's temple, then dribbled down the side of his face. He could see his prints a little more clearly now. LeBlanc's skin was like the parchment of an ancient scroll, blasted thin and cracked by the sheer weight of time held at bay. There was no nose on that face, just a triangle-shaped void with a delicate strip of cartilage jutting out of it. Hirth held his breath as LeBlanc seemed to sniff the air with that non-nose. Then, his bare feet caressing the asphalt that had been choking creation for decades, LeBlanc proceeded slowly to the rear of the Cadillac. Moments later, Hirth was shutting the trunk. Hirth stood alone beside the Cadillac and continued to wait. Just the faintest smear of sunlight began to appear on the horizon past the sagging roofline of the shopping center. There was more movement in the doorway of the old dry cleaners. Shuddering, Petey Ghee emerged from out of it. Hirth smirked contemptuously at the expression of shock and horror that seemed to be frozen onto Ghee's face. "Not what you were expecting, was it?" Hirth called over. Ghee buckled at the knees and clung to the side of the doorframe. He was unable to move as Hirth strode over to him. With his hands on his hips, Hirth glowered down at the man who had cowered before him. "Welcome to the big time," Hirth said. Ghee stared blankly into the night air for several minutes, not blinking. Eventually, he slowly let go of the doorframe and stood a little more erect. Ghee took a tentative step past Hirth, then another. Slowly, deliberately, as if counting his steps, Ghee crossed the trash-strewn parking lot to where he had left his sports car. Hirth followed him, vindictive and amused. Ghee opened the passenger side door and bent his thin waist to rummage through the contents of the tiny back seat. Ghee reemerged with a scarlet silk bag drawn closed with a golden cord. Still walking shakily while looking down at his feet like someone who had just been in a car wreck, Ghee moved away from Hirth and the two vehicles. He stopped when he was just under the light of the last working lamppost. His hands were shaking badly, but he still managed to hang on to his red silk bag. Hirth walked over and stood next to Ghee, scowling down at him and at the bag. Ghee undid the gold cord. He stooped down and with both hands swung the bag close to the ground so that its contents spilled out and rolled across the parking lot. Dozens of glass marbles scattered across the pavement, following random paths over the uneven surface. Ghee stayed stooped over, watching. Every sinew in his body tensed with anticipation as the marbles, each with its own color and diameter, rolled and spun. Their clinks echoed eerily in the empty parking lot. As the last marble came to rest, Ghee observed intently where each one had come to rest. Ghee remained in the hunched-over pose, looking dumbfounded. He started saying, "No, no, 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 no," in an appalled tone of voice. "You're supposed to find Jack Turner," Hirth growled behind him. "Is this how you're going to find Jack Turner?" This seemed to finally snap Ghee out of his stupor. He straightened, turned, and looked up at Hirth. "I will find Jack Turner," he said to Hirth matter-of-factly. Hirth snorted contemptuously. "I think all you'll find is that you're in way over your head," Hirth cackled. "You better find Turner if you don't want to be sundered." Hirth turned away. "Good luck with your marbles," Hirth sneered over his shoulder. He got into the Cadillac, fired up the engine, and drove away. Ghee stood alone as an empty shopping bag drifted past him on the breeze. The bats had all disappeared. The top of the sun's corona over the eastern horizon began to flood the parking lot with pale light. Long shadows began to form as Ghee walked around carefully gathering the glass marbles back into the red bag. Then Ghee climbed back inside his sports car and drove off.